So welcome everybody in the middle of Istanbul week, right in the middle, and actually we think we are about on the start of Istanbul century because we just will open the Studio-X in Istanbul in only like 3 weeks or so. So we are very excited, but particularly warm welcome to Selva and Gregers who will speak a little bit about their work tonight in dialogue with Prem, who's sitting way over there like he will be kind of adversary, and a great distance. And even there was some distance in the office because Selva is trained in SIAC in California, where the weather is incredibly beautiful all the time. It never gets cold. And Gregers is from Aarhus School of Architecture in Denmark, where sometimes it gets cold. So very, very different points of view and places, but they meet together in the office of Rem Koolhaas, which of course is an office that, like this school, is a place where people from very different trajectories meet. And even you could argue that OMA is a kind of a school. If a school helps people to sort of accelerate their potential to come up with new ideas and so on, OMA is one of the very few offices in which people seem to leave the office with more strength than they came in. And so it has given birth to many incredibly interesting offices, and actually the Superpool office is a good example, but still a young office, 2006, so a short amount of time. It's completely impossible to characterize this office. And I think that's also a sign that it's good and interesting. It's of course some kind of confusion of research and design that you could imagine in the kind of OMA context, but also the Columbia context. New forms of mapping, new forms of exhibition, new forms of construction. They do a lot of work with robotics and concrete, but at the same time they're working with robots and concrete, they are making new kinds of maps. So you get this very delicate research, very sort of sophisticated analysis of Turkey with like 100 maps revealing all sorts of patterns in Turkey that nobody quite realized before they do the maps, but at the same time they have these huge machines making lumps of concrete. So again, I think a very beautiful office, also taken very seriously, operating on the international stage, like with Audi being involved in the Audi Urban Future initiative, doing kind of major work, but also kind of micro work. So there's a lot of kind of micro techniques and so on. What I particularly like about the office is that they cultivate new forms of conversation. If you go to their studio, you realize that a lot of young architects from Istanbul are spending time in that studio because they're acting as hosts of the conversation, and literally Selva will be as director of the Studio-X, the host, but also in partnership with Gregers also. So I think it's great. And already tonight, rather than give a straightforward lecture, they'd like to be in this kind of tennis match with the Prem sitting way over there, who they have worked in collaboration with Prem, who's also really a good friend of the school and collaborator of the school, not only for the projects and the work of what used to be called graphic design, but now it's something more interesting, but also in the P space, which opens 2012 in Chinatown in New York. So again, another experimental space which is hosting different forms of exhibition and conversation. So I actually think it's sort of super interesting that you opened a funky space in Chinatown a short time ago, and we open our funky space soon. And probably all of these spaces will be somehow networked together. So again, just really super warm welcome to Selvas and Gregers, who are two of the nicest people you will ever meet. But be warned, they're also very dangerous people. They really have ideas, and they really help other people to have ideas, and this is very transformative. So I like it when nice people are the transformative ones. So I like you guys, and welcome to your own school.
Okay, let's hope we can live up to that introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. You already revealed what we're going to talk about today. So, anyhow, let's start.
We are, yes, as Mark kind of explained a bit, we are a practice that started in 2006 in Istanbul. And we won't really go through in detail with the introduction of Istanbul. We will just kind of show 3 images. And this is what you would see as a tourist typically. And that's actually kind of the Istanbul Week postcard image as well. But if you're a little bit more adventurous, then you would end up crossing the Bosphorus, and maybe you would run into this, kind of a very tranquil city as well.
whereas, of course, Istanbul is also trying to be the financial hub of the region. So Istanbul is many things, and that's also what is kind of making our life and work there very rewarding.
So from an architectural perspective, of course, there's all that big building going on, and in some way, obviously, as an architecture office, we try to get a part on that as well. So we will start with a project that we have done together with Bjarke Engels Group, and called Suryapu project, where a developer invited 6 teams to look at the site. It's one of the kind of last remaining big sites in the inner city on the Asian side.
So what do you do? This piece of green piece of land is as big as any of the biggest parks of the city. So it's significant. And in a city that has extreme lack of green spaces is precious.
So in a way, it was a very easy collaboration because both offices had kind of a very sort of immediate instinct not to build on the site and somehow protect the site. And it's funny because Suryapu also in Turkish literally means a citadel. So kind of the cosmos came together in some ways, and we said, okay, let's do a project that is, in essence, kind of a perimeter block, but in a giant one.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should give a little bit context of Istanbul. So what you see at the top is the typical development style of the city. Of course, many other big cities as well. And the city have somehow forgotten the perimeter building and what it can do for a neighborhood.
So then, of course, there's a lot of architectural tricks you can do to make that exciting, and but at the same time argue that it performs better for sun, for wind, for the views, and so forth, and kind of give it a shape that's both performing and at the same time exciting. And this is what it looks like. We didn't win the competition. It was very difficult for the developer team to agree to the fees, I think, that in essence, because we were international collaboration, and at the end of the day, it was European prices, and it just didn't work out in terms of the logistics, let's say. And because the client told us, you know, I know I would have won a lot of awards, and it would have been a very wonderful project, but I wouldn't make enough money on it, so be it. But what they're building is sort of a hybrid of this project in some ways, that there's longer blocks along the periphery, and there's 2 towers in the middle. So that's going on now.
Yeah. And if we go a little bit back in time, we arrived in Istanbul, and this is the everyday for, let's say, 90% of the inhabitants of Istanbul. We call it the soup. It's a general smear of 4 to 5 story buildings, and it covers a large part of the city.
So when we came to Istanbul from New York, of course, it's kind of, New York is a very easy to navigate city, and we're in Istanbul. Gregors doesn't speak much Turkish still, but anyhow, so the transportation and navigation is an issue. How do you, and this is before the iPhone and the Google Maps. So how do you navigate in a city? So we realize this as a kind of personal problem in our lives, like how to explain the city. Then we also realize it's actually a citywide problem. There's not enough maps. There's just not, these networks have not been mapped in a publicly accessible manner. So it was actually Gregors' idea to do a bus map, and we sort of made it into a joke and did a minibus map. These minibuses are quite peculiar because they are individually owned, and they kind of don't run on a schedule. They kind of, you can hail them when you see one, and you can hop on, and they have sort of, they don't really have stops. It was an informal system, now it's formalized, but it still has that character of an informal sort of transportation system. Yeah,
but it's ingenious in the sense that it compensates for a growing city that can't grow its public transport system fast enough. So when you map them, it's of course useless because the moment you print it, the map is outdated.
So in a sense, it was an art project, but it kind of put us on the. It opened up a trajectory for us of research. It was for sale by a small souvenir company, overpriced. It was a joke because the people who would buy it would be tourists, but tourists would never really dare to get on these buses, and the local population would never need them. So, but at the same time, it was an important object to have to make.
Yeah, it's a perfectly operational system that you just work by word of mouth, right? You talk to the driver and say, hey, I need to go here, and he will tell you, okay, go take that bus over there.
And we should say one last thing, that the data collection was done completely guerrilla style. We actually took all the minibuses and we tracked their routes and put the map together completely by hand in a way. So, yeah. But it led to a much more serious work called Mapping Istanbul, which was a 2-year effort. It started as an exhibition. It ended up being a book. And the book was done in collaboration with Prem and Projects. And a lot of other scholars also contributed.
Yeah, but so that basically started back in 2009, our first interaction with PP. But so Mapping Istanbul was a snapshot of Turkey globally, regionally, and also Istanbul in itself.
And it was kind of new in the sense that a collection of maps of a contemporary situation in Istanbul is not really, it didn't really exist in a way. So it was, maybe the content wasn't so sharp, but there wasn't ever a collection of maps at the scale done before. So for us it was it was a comment, we could do it, it can be done. And it can be done also without any public institutional support, aside from a cultural institution called SALT that was the commissioner. But it looked at Istanbul kind of and its connectivity in the country itself. This is a bus map originating from Istanbul. This is an education map. For us, it's always a very emotional map to show because politically, historically, we always talk about the east and the west of the country. And here you see it is just there's a clear divide in terms of the education levels. The darker it is, the more educated. And so it's not a synthetic kind of description, this east and west. It actually has a very clear reality to it.
So of course, we also looked at the city of Istanbul itself. And again, here darker is older. And as you see now, Istanbul is actually a very young city. Right? Most of the city is built after 1950. And the old core is really a very, very small part of the contemporary Istanbul. When we look at the city with economical eyes, like what do you call it, household sizes, income level, and so forth, is rather expected. Where you have water or view, that's where let's say the more wealthy population lives.
So you will always there's always a front side and a back side of the hills towards the Bosphorus and the Marmara Sea. So here you kind of can see the pattern. We also, yeah.
Again, buses, there's 500 bus lines in Istanbul. There's still not a bus map of that. So how the hell do people navigate? We don't know, but at least we started trying to understand the intensity of that. You can also start understanding where are centers of the city in this, let's say, contemporary city.
This is the soccer fields, because like the Dolmuş and Minibüs, there's a kind of always a compensation from the private sector, but a small private sector kind of companies. So here you see all the soccer fields you can rent to play football, and then the big stadiums, and they somehow compensate for the lack of green space in some areas and the other sort of infrastructure. Here you see all the street bazaars. I mean, all of these things that are a little bit more informal we see as a strength of the city, and we try to keep talking about them to kind of create awareness that these things are fragile, they could disappear, but they bring a wealth to the city when they're around. So
here you see the street bazaars in the college is at another day of the week. These are bazaars that moves from each neighborhood, and every neighborhood has their own bazaar day.
And so there's quite a few other mapping projects, but we're not showing those now. What we do now is for a magazine which gets published every month. It's very cheap. It's like $2 on the street. You can, but it has a very intellectual contribution list, and we do one map every month. Our theme is environment usually, but here you see the registered architects, urban designers, and landscape designers across the nation. And then we have done a park map. This was actually before the summer, and we were looking at the parks and the public transportation, how to get to each park. And the idea is that you would cut these and put them in your pocket if you wanted to use them as a young person So this is the current version of the mapping that we're doing.
Yeah, this is a bicycle map, and Istanbul, for those who've been there, you know, it's a very hilly city. You're trying to deal with the conception that Istanbul is too hilly to bike in. But if you look carefully, look at topography and the street patterns, you will see, of course, there are horizontal streets in Istanbul, and you can actually bike on them. So if you plan your route clever, Istanbul is bikeable. It might not be safe today, but in the future, I'm sure it can be done.
This work is also a collaborative work together with Pelin Darwish. She's acting as our editor and graphic designer as well. So, you know, it keeps the dialogue going among our friends and kind of has an output, which is typically what we're interested in the office, that there is always a pragmatic output of whatever conversation we're interested in. And in this is the hydroelectrical plants that are being planned in the yellow ones across the nation. And of course it means a lot for the environment, but that it's not being publicly debated. So it's important to show the extent that the government is planning to kind of do things in the environment that, you know, hopefully are good, but probably not.
As Mark mentioned, we were part of the Audio Urban Future Award last year. 5 cities were chosen, and we were looking at Istanbul for what is mobility in 2030 was the question Audi asked.
So we had a sort of simple idea, because we wanted to talk about more than mobility, so we had these Dolmuşes back again, and if you used shared mobility, you would be winning points. And with the points you collected, you would be able to rent or occupy space in your neighborhood or in the city. So this was sort of a online platform that would kind of help facilitate that. We called it Park. And before, of course, Audi gave us a brief where we had to talk about mobility and traffic and future and technology, but we felt it was urgent to talk about community building, democracy and participation at that particular moment in Istanbul. So we had this kind of lofty phrase: the future of democracy is in the streets where cars have freed up space for Park being this online platform. And we sort of unpacked it and had individual movies about what does it mean, the future of democracy, why is it interesting, what about streets, what about cars, and what about Park. And we'll show you some of the ideas now.
Yeah, so Istanbul is the most congested city in Europe, which is evident on this little movie as well.
But at the same time, actually, the car ownership is fairly low. So, and part of the reason is, of course, the Bosphorus is a divide on in the city. So there's a lot of commuting back and forth. But there's these 2 bottlenecks of the bridges. So that means on the main arteries there's always traffic. So, but what we thought was kind of potentially in a daily life more congested was actually the neighborhood streets. And this is actually a typical day in our neighborhood around the office. There's nothing much staged about this movie except the fact that Mehmet is trying to use the sidewalk.
And it's snowing. But yeah, so life on the streets are difficult. I mean, that's it's a challenge in, let's say, for the everyday person. So the problem is not the cars moving, it's the problem is the cars parked.
So what is the future of mobility in Istanbul? When Audi asked it to us, and we were like, okay, the answer is maybe easy, maybe we should look at the past for the models. And this idea of shared mobility, which was already a fascination for us, it came back as a theme to work on again.
So of course, maybe these vehicles, which are today's version of it, are probably not the most environmental friendly, they're not the most comfortable, but the system itself is quite ingenious.
And there's, of course, new types of car sharing, be that zip car or city cars or carpooling or all kind of new ways of doing it. So we were also interested in developing a new language around the Dolmuş system. And those companies like Zipcar have research, of course it should be in there. You know, could be a little bit biased, but that every shared car takes up about 20 cars off from traffic. So Istanbul with 20 times less traffic would be a paradise. So that's what we took as a base. Again, it's interesting in Istanbul, this ownership issue, that some some actually modes of transportation are individually owned, be that like small boats, taxis. Even there is a bus that's called the private public bus, which is also individually owned. So then we thought maybe it's clever to talk about this as a kind of crowdsourcing project. Yes, in today's language, maybe that's what we would call it.
So what are we doing with this space that we are gaining back if we can, let's say, relieve some of the cars from the street, and why is it important? I think in Istanbul we think that the streets are really where the life is, where the public life is. That's where you celebrate, it's where you demonstrate, it's where you take a break, it's where the family gets together. But it's also happening amongst increasing amount of cars. Like here is the only place in the center of city, of Beyoğlu, where you can get to the water, and it's a parking lot. So cars is a serious problem.
But then again, from a social perspective, the streets are, especially in the summer of 2012, we thought it was very important to stress the fact that it's also where people get together. So that's where, if you have a healthy street life, you have a healthy society, most likely. So that's also a good indicator. And of course, we're not the first ones to talk about it. In the 70s, there was a lot of talk here in New York on the streets and street democracy, and a lot of the work by Jane Jacobs is also a part of this discourse. And we wanted to touch upon that, but in a new way. So we had this platform, yes, and here Mete Amca has collected a lot of points, so he can kind of come out and play backgammon in his street with his friends. We made these movies that would talk about the future and how it could be, potentially. And then the same idea, of course, carried for public spaces. This is Taksim Square. And we were actually quite heavy-handed in our message, what Taksim Square could mean. There will be a little voiceover now, in a second. But the idea is that public space could have changing faces.
An application for social interaction and mobility will transform the gathering places of the city into platforms for democracy. For instance, the proposals for the coming Sunday at Taksim Square will be selected from an events options posted online. The most important aspect of the project is that not only the proposals that get the most points, but also the ones that get the least, will be able to voice their opinions and talk about the issues they care about. Because a public sphere can only become democratic if minorities too can express their thoughts. All power to the imagination. Now let's take a look at what's happening in Taksim Square in 2030.
Okay, so that was sort of, the message. It was very clear and loud, and we thought it was important to talk about the social infrastructures along with the hardware of the city, because Turkey is rewriting its constitution for the 8th time. Every 20 years we rewrite it, and every 20 years we pretty much rebuild the city. So could we actually do these things together? And that was our main question. And how could that be more inclusive? When we presented this slide for the first time, I didn't know there's 28 spoken languages in Turkey, and I found it when I Googled it. So, and in a way, I'm somewhat educated. The fact that I didn't know this kind of is an indicator that not everything is easily out in the open and easily kind of operating in the system. So this was our issue.
Yeah. Another, let's say, thing on top of this was Istanbul is the second largest Facebook city in the world, only after Jakarta, with back then 9 million users. I think I guess talks about how well the city is connected within itself, or how disconnected when that many people are on a social media platform to communicate. And so of course we were trying to imagine how this could be harnessed in a more productive way than just let's say gossiping.
So here you'll see a short movie that kind of talks about how this platform could function.
It works like this. You gain points every time you choose to travel by intelligent Dolmuş. With the points you collect, you get to rent space and organize events. Now let's take a look at how Elif is using Park. Elif wakes up and starts planning her day on Park. Elif looks at the many things happening in Beyoğlu today. She likes to live in Beyoğlu because there are many neighborhood events along with interesting institutional programs. Here is an invitation posted by Leila and Mehmet. Seems like their son Malik has learned how to ride a bike. Elif loves little Malik and would be happy to celebrate his achievement this evening. The event needs one more supporter for it to happen. She gladly accepts. The celebration will be on their street tonight. What else is happening in her neighborhood? Elif wants to run tomorrow morning at Gezi Park. So she goes to her neighborhood groups and writes to the morning runners. Seems like Lucas is up for a morning run. Elif also likes to cook in the communal kitchen. She will throw a feast next Friday. Many different communities organize events on Park. Elif is an architect and checks today's professional events in her city. Is there something that fits her schedule? These are all the architectural events located on the map. She can see when and where each event takes place. This urbanism workshop looks interesting. Let's see how it can be incorporated in her route today. Here's a list of all her appointments. She can easily go to the workshop before her doctor's appointment. Park places all her scheduled events on the map and suggests an efficient mode of transportation to get from place to place. The planner suggests the most efficient routes, taking into consideration the weather, traffic, and events on the streets. One of her colleagues, Hande, is also going to the same event. Great, Elif and Hande can share a Dolmuş and earn points. Elif usually prefers to take the mode of transportation that gets her the most points, even if it means walking a little. On her profile, Elif shares all the pictures taken at the events she has hosted. She can also keep track of how she is gaining and sharing her points. By mostly taking shared transportation, Elif has collected a lot of points and helped organize many community events. She especially likes engaging youngsters to help them learn fun things and make sure everybody cleans up after. She has gotten such good feedback that she is now on the run to becoming a neighborhood leader. Support Elif by attending one of her Robots for Kids workshops. And remember, with Park, you too can make a difference in your community.
So that was our proposal, and it came with the exhibition in Istanbul, where all teams were presenting their work in their individual cubes, and we had sort of a wall of kind of explanation movies and a kind of interior space that had these atmospheric movies of life in 2030 on Taksim Square and the neighborhoods behind it. But in some ways, the project was a little bit too abstract for Audi's taste, so we didn't win. But it's been it was funny because both Mumbai, Istanbul, and almost a little bit Rio, Sao Paulo, sorry, because of their own contexts, they were all a little bit complicated projects. It was they were a little bit more subtle.
Yeah, I mean, but interesting for both of them that in none of the cities that was actually proposal for building anything. They were all playing on this kind of more soft systems or tools for the city. But now we invite Prem to play some maybe table tennis. I don't know if it's tennis or table.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe you guys didn't win the Audi competition because you also were saying that they should get rid of cars and have minibuses. I mean, I wondered if that might have been one of the reasons. Hello? Is this on?
Well, you know, I mean, but they know that already, no? I mean, that was why they had the competition in the first place, because they knew
they were going out of business, right? So it's just a matter of what kind of business do you want to do.
Exactly. I mean, but I think that's one of. I mean, I think there are going to be a lot of themes that will keep coming up in your presentation, I'm sure. But one of them is really this tension between public space and kind of private ownership in a lot of different ways, which somehow it kind of crystallized, seeing this. This is really the first time I'm seeing this project too. It's interesting because the Istanbul scene too has, in some ways, one might compare it more to a situation like New York, for example, whereas in Istanbul, all the projects you're talking about are not they're not civic projects, they're not funded by the government. In fact, there's, as we'll, you know, you guys might talk about, there's sometimes an antagonism, there's a tension between the kind of official government and the way in which public life is kind of constituted there. And it's interesting, like, you know, the projects you're talking about are funded by Garanti Bank, they're funded by Audi, but they essentially are these interventions of public space. And I can't help but thinking of things like the City Bike program in New York that are also similarly corporate models. And I'm just wondering, for you guys, coming to Istanbul also from the context of Denmark, and I mean in particular for Gregors, like thinking about that, how do you see that kind of tension resolving itself? I mean, how, it seems very clear in here that there is some sort of play.
Yeah, no, it's very confusing for me coming from probably the role model of state-supported projects. Right, every time we start these projects, I think, but we should also talk to the city officials, and Selva will say, no need for that. So
I don't say no need for that. I say they will find us if they're interested. Don't worry. So you know, let's do it, and let's kind of create a dialogue that we want to create, and hopefully we will lure them in. Yeah. But yeah, sorry.
No. I mean, so I think it's what did I want to say? It's actually.
No, I mean, to get back to your question, it is a, you know, when does private become not so nice? I don't know. I mean, this is a question that I keep asking myself. Like, it's very interesting to have a Dolmuş minibus system which is owned by individuals. When does it become private? Becomes kind of the enemy? It's a kind of an interesting question I've been asking myself also. Like, what? Maybe it was always private, and maybe it should remain being that, because private could also mean individuals, and individuals is the public. Then, you know, then what's the big deal? But it's a question to keep asking. I think, like, is there a size issue, like or is there a revenue problem? Like, if you over a couple millions, then you are not such a nice company anymore. But we have Borusan here, who is one of our funders also for the Studio-X project. I mean, without them, this dialogue would not start. So, you know, the whole conversation of public and private, it really needs to be looked at. And Istanbul, because it's so kind of fuzzy, I think creates a good environment to study that issue.
Yeah, I think it, definitely gives, compared to when I look back to Denmark, there's a completely other dynamic because of all the private initiative, right? You're not sitting and waiting for the state to come and fund your great idea. You have to go out and do it yourself. I mean, that's the certain power in that too.
Thank you for that excellent question.
Okay, this is actually the second time we encountered projects with this Becoming Istanbul exhibition. It started in Frankfurt at the DAM, Deutsche Architecture Museum, I think.
Where the maps you see in the back, actually, before they became a book, they were a slideshow. And you see them sort of in the back. Yeah. But 2 years later, the project came to the exhibition came to Istanbul. It was actually shown in many other places before it came to Istanbul, and by that time we had the book, so the maps wasn't really a part of it anymore, but we still had to come up with a kind of an idea around a database. It was called the Becoming Istanbul, the show. And here you see Prem's excellent work of the title wall. I was very proud of it. We were very proud that we could manufacture it in the way Prem specified. And it was, in that sense, actually, it's also a very exciting project for us because it was a very seamless collaboration between a graphic design firm and an architecture firm, and also the curatorial team to both develop the idea of the project and also develop the spaces and the final exhibition itself. Here you see the... Yeah?
Okay. But if we step just one step back to explain the size of the project, because Becoming Istanbul is actually many things. It's this database, it's the Mapping Istanbul book, it's an essay collection called Becoming Istanbul, and it's also an aerial photography book called Tracing Istanbul. So it's actually quite a big project that finally came to its, let's say, conclusion here in Istanbul.
The importance of it is, I think, such that Istanbul at the moment is identifying itself as a city in flux. So it actually accepts change and it actually anticipates change all the time. So then you have the reflex from us is to actually have to create some sort of archive, some sort of memory, because it's very difficult to keep the memory of things because it's just really wants to change. So the archival projects like Becoming Istanbul, I think, have that significance in the context of Istanbul. So this database is online and it's accessible. If you're interested in researching anything about Istanbul, I would recommend you check it out. It's called becomingistanbul.org. Yeah. And we thought, like, for the browsing of the database, we had this kind of dark space. It was also a little bit contrast of the previous Frankfurt show.
Yeah. But the exhibition itself was two other components, so 90, which refers to the 90 days the show was on, and then the making of Beyoğlu. The 90 was an event space where every day at 6:30, I think similar to here, there was a talk throughout the exhibition. And the exhibition, and this space was made up of this three-dimensional calendar. And each box was a day in those 90 days with the date, the name of the speaker, and the topic they were talking about. The third space was this gaming space where Dutch urbanists would come and held 6 games on important topics of the city. Of course, being in a museum, we were trying to make people at ease because we asked them very serious questions. And while being a museum where they're not, you normally don't interact with the content in a very outspoken way.
So the idea was to make sort of almost like a kindergarten-like space so that people would feel at ease and be participating in this game. And then the signage system and the wayfinding system was based on LEDs, which when Prem was also visiting Istanbul, he was quite attracted to them. And it was like, we wanted to use them because you always see them around in the city and somehow bring it into the gallery space. So we had these LED strips which you could type questions into them. So we had a station where you could go and type questions as the audience, and they would be broadcasted around the building, would kind of help you also navigate. So there was a collection of these questions as well. So that was all about collecting and so forth. But here we were also invited to do the UAE Pavilion in Venice Biennial 3 years ago, where it was the second time the UAE was participating, so it was called the second time around.
The UAE is they're very young in the biennial, but they have also secured the largest space in the Arsenale. And the curator had picked 3 artists to represent the UAE.
And he wanted us, it was kind of a strange problem. He said, we have the biggest space, but I'm going to only show 3 artists, so we need to make sure the space feels full. Let's figure that out. And we were like, okay, fine, that's a good challenge. And because the 3 different artists had different kind of media that they were working in, we gave them each a support structure, or what we called islands. So there was 3 islands in the space. We didn't want to really break it with walls. We just wanted to kind of both celebrate the beauty of the space itself and still accommodate the work.
Probably most of you have been there, so there is a tendency to make this beautiful building into white boxes, so you completely forget where you are. But there is actually something to celebrate here besides the artwork itself. So the first artist was Lativa, that does large-scale photography. So we gave her this structure that both allow you to enjoy each of these through a series of photography as complete pieces, but also as individual pieces that you can walk towards one image and you will leave the other ones behind. Second one was REAN, that does large-scale installation projects that try to talk about the continuous ongoing urban development in Dubai. So we gave her a kind of a container that could contain her sprawling installation, and you can walk around it and enjoy it from different heights. And the third gentleman is living in the desert, and his art is mainly found objects that he then transformed.
So this was kind of we're just showing these as types of exhibition work we have done. There's another project, this is also one of our first projects, called the Open Library. Again, for Garanti, supported platform Garanti at the time. It's now called SALT. It is on this street, which is the main pedestrian street in Istanbul, where about 2 million people walk it on a weekday. So it's, weekend day. So it's very busy, it can get as crowded as this image. This is very typical of Istiklal. And then they have a space on the ground floor, or they used to have this space, and the idea was to put their library on that ground floor space, because they were tired of doing exhibitions, and they wanted to take a break and kind of put their library as the show. So it was quite fun, and we typically work with making a lot of models to talk to the client and kind of come to a consensus with him, with him or her, what the best design idea is. And here we thought it would be kind of a nice thing to have somehow a stage set up where we would have almost like bleachers on one side and the books on the other in this long space.
Yeah, so the final design had this 20-meter long bookshelf on one wall, 4 meter tall, that kind of spanned the entire length of the space.
It was built out of foam. We did a collaboration with a furniture company called Queens and Milan out of Belgium. So it was a very quiet space in contrast to that very busy street, and actually people came and brought their scanners even and scanned books, and it was really kind of well used, and it was, again, one of the first projects we did, so we're one of the ones that we're most proud of in some ways.
Yeah, you see here one of those 4 meter tall and 1 meter wide styrofoam elements that magically could carry all these heavy books. As Mark mentioned in the beginning, we do a very different type of work.
This is we thought, so this is called Tailorcrete. Tailorcrete is a material research. It looks into robotics and concrete, especially in the context of Europe, because Europe actually does a lot of precast architecture or construction work, but to build something that's three-dimensional or kind of has complexity in geometry is very expensive, obviously because of the labor costs and so forth, and there's not much mechanization in that.
Yeah, to step one back 1 second, it's a quite large project. It's 14 partners from the kind of that mirrors the concrete industry. So we have concrete suppliers, we have reinforcement suppliers, we have also researchers that so academia and
yeah,
industry
so
partners.
it's a kind of large project spanning 4 years, and we are the only architecture team, like kind of a proper architecture team in the project. We were charged to kind of think about the conceptual framework. Why is it interesting to think about complex shapes? And here of course, there's the demand, because when you look at Design, which kind of a blog like Design, which has only competition projects or mostly competition projects, you see half of the projects have complex designs, but when you look at ArchDaily, then you see it's only 20% of the projects have complexity. So there's definitely a market gap, and then the construction sector knows this. But from a design point of view, of course, an architect is always asked, like, why would you need to build this? What is wrong with straight walls? And in some ways, actually, the software we have nowadays can also create performance criteria, like why shapes would make sense as they maybe also did in the past. So it's a from file to factory process. We were looking at, we developed a plugin for Rhino that can evaluate the geometry as you're designing it. And here you see kind of screenshots of the software. This was done primarily by ETH and design to production. So all different partners have different roles, and it all comes together.
So, but actually, one of the more constraining, let's say, aspects when you talk about building, let's say, complex geometries is the formwork. So, quite a lot of effort was put into thinking about new types of formwork. There was also some refinement of the existing types. The most exciting one, or let's say new coming on the scene, was to use wax for pouring concrete into. So we will pour the wax into a digital mold, take the wax to the side or off-site, pour concrete into this new formwork, and we can remelt the wax afterwards.
Of course, today it's also kind of a conventional method to mill into styrofoam, and there was some development done on that part as well to come up with releasing agents and also optimization of the tool paths so that it can be done faster. We developed rubber membrane because the issue is always in the demolding. You can carve whatever you want, but then how do you demold, and is there a way to recycle the piece after you demold it? So these were all kind of the issues that are being addressed, and along with, of course, this concrete and the special type of concrete you need to have so you can use it. And this is the star of the show, is this little robot tool that was developed, which can do three-dimensional bending of rebar and assembly. Here you see it.
Yeah, still in early prototype stages. So because today, like when you start talking about complex geometries, you can't really assemble three-dimensional meshes because you can really not evaluate as a person if this bend is actually what you need to. So to demonstrate all these, let's say, improvements in various parts of the process of building complex geometries, a prototype is under construction now up in Denmark. We'll build this, which is called the fish these days. And this is recent photos from the site. We slowly start building up.
You see the foam blocks coming, and yeah. So it's going to be pretty large actually. We were looking always for a public client for a potential project, and our contractor was actually a Spanish contractor, and then the contractor went bankrupt and so forth. So the whole story basically now it's a demonstrator in the office park for a formwork supplier who's one of the partners. But we will have an opening party no matter what, I think, at the end of the year for their shed. Anyhow, so that's also quite an exciting project, but we learned that these research projects, of course, move at a much different speed than the commercial world. We realize it's actually much slower, that every 6 months maybe something happens. So quite interesting learning process also.
We realized it took 4 years to plan this little structure. Could, of course, not survive in, let's say, the commercial world. Yeah, so let's continue. We'll show you one more architectural project. It's the Şişli High School. It was a competition project again, and it was looking at a site in Istanbul, in Şişli, which is a very dense area. Here, the only green areas that are left are either cemeteries or courtyards of hospitals. But actually on a very interesting site, to be understood in that way. It's super dense. You have a 40-story high-rise on one side. You have the site itself has a drop of 20 meters from top to bottom. So the project was to demolish this pink building in the middle and re-intake this triangular site. So this was in the 50s. There was nothing out there in Şişli, and this is how it looked before as the competition was put out. Typical way of dealing with change in topography is to build big platforms and put some boxes on top without really realizing the potential of this 20-meter drop, which is actually a 5-story building if you just build into it. So the project kind of, instead of creating a void in yet another void in the city, was trying to mend back the fabric of the city. So you can imagine as a normal inhabitants of the neighborhood, they can walk through the school. The classrooms will have direct access to light and also green space.
So we got an honorable mention in this project, and one of the jury members came up to me afterwards and said, you know, we know this is the future, but we're not there yet. So we took that as a good sign. Like, so, but then something happened, and Future came to Istanbul this summer. So we don't really know yet what the outcome of that will be. But suddenly the public debate that we were trying to have about public space with either the Audi project or the mapping projects and so forth suddenly became the main agenda for months over the summer. So we are in that setting quite excited to start Studio-X, even though it means there's a lot more tension. But then we also realize that it's a very relevant project to have Studio-X in Istanbul. And this is what it looks like these days. All right, thank you.
Well, now I guess I know that not only does Columbia and Studio-X have Audi, but there's probably a motorcycle manufacturer in there too. No, but that was great, and I mean I think thank you so much. I mean, I think that it actually crystallized a lot of things. I mean, I've known you for a number of years. We've worked together. But what really struck me in particular with the Taylor Crete and with some of these other projects is the way in which, I mean, this might sound banal, but how entrepreneurial your practice is and how Superpool as a practice seems so much about not just kind of creating solutions, but actually creating situations or kind of platforms, to use a word that's probably overused. But the idea of, you know, you're creating these tools that other people can use, whether they're plugins for things that for software that allow other people to develop a certain kind of geometry, or rather than building a school or designing a kind of school that's simply a set of buildings, creating a set of buildings that actually works with the landscape so that other people have a kind of public space that's created out of that, which is very related, of course, to the park project and the idea of kind of reclaiming these parking spaces as something that could be spaces for public assembly. And I mean, so it's really kind of striking to me also in the sense of thinking about the curatorial, how, you know, in your exhibition designs, you're also working on some level in this kind of in-between space between designing, you're working curatorially, but within a formal vocabulary, which is quite striking as well. I mean, I'm curious in particular with the curatorial projects, to start with that, like what kind of, like how do you view the kind of dialogue of triangulating, think about the Venice Pavilion, for example, between the kind of curators and the artists and kind of dealing with all of these different constituencies? How does Superpool think about kind of creating those conditions of dialogue?
I mean, I will go back to the beginning of the question as well. I think the issue of tools is very interesting for us because the current architectural climate in Istanbul is very much the opposite. There's questions and there's answers, and you know, then we tried to run away from that scene. We tried to kind of create a body of work that would be interesting enough that the clients that would be interested in us would be themselves interesting. So, I mean, it's not a very easy thing to keep an office sustainable with projects like what we do, where we don't rely actually on built work. But at the same time, it was possible, and we realized that it's very interesting that it is possible that you can actually have a research interest, and you can actually draw people who are commissioning you for the research. Most of the research work we have done is actually commissioned. Yes, we do some of the maps we're doing are kind of for fun, but because we can do them at low cost right now. So this so that dialogue is at every level is interesting for us. That we don't have a kind of a housing company that comes and asks us, do us a building. In a way, we do projects that we know we will lose, just because because for us, it's more interesting to open up a conversation that wasn't there before than winning that competition or that project. So, of course, then the art projects or the exhibitions are in some ways the dream clients, because the client is already interested in doing something that's, it's exciting, or it offers a new solution, or it, wants to address a new conversation. So it becomes very exciting that it's very almost difficult not to engage them at the curatorial level as well and kind of contribute to the project from the beginning. And hopefully, Prem, we've done that together with you, and hopefully we will keep doing that together with you. That's also, we are a small office, and when we named the office Superpool, we wanted to talk about a kind of a pool of resources of collaboration. And in some ways, we had the idea, almost like OMA in our head, of a big office with a lot of talented people. But what we are realizing is actually maybe we're a small office that learns to collaborate with so many different people around the world, and that's actually the Superpool that we are interested in. So in that sense, the curator as a client becomes also our collaborator, and it only makes sense that it is that way.
I mean, there's something, again, this may sound banal, but I mean, I think there's something incredibly idealistic in an optimistic way that's actually encouraging to think about, rather than kind of doing a competition and saying, well, we're doing this within its own constraints, we are creating some other space for it. Or even, it's interesting to me that a thing like the Dolmuş map, which maybe started as a kind of speculative project, then became a kind of commission to do a set of research which didn't exist. I mean, I remember during Mapping Istanbul, one of the really interesting things was, New York had the plan for New York and all of these public maps of the city available for a number of decades, which Istanbul has never had, but that has to be itself created by a private entity. And then that leads to the kind of discourse of even this monthly column in a newspaper. So the way in which these things are generative. I mean, I'm curious, in the time, you guys have been in Istanbul for 10 years or? 7. So, even within that time, I mean, do you see, obviously things have changed. This summer was a really dramatic moment too. Have you seen the kind of architectural discourse changing there, or within, how have you noticed that?
I mean, so the city is, let's say, growing up also from a design point of view. When we came, there was a lot of support for the art world, and it has been going on for quite a number of years. That's also why we, let's say, turned to the art world for support for projects. But since then, now we have several, let's say, institutionalized venues for architects, or particularly young architects, to let's say, display their work or invent projects that they couldn't before now. So we have a design biennial. There is MoMA has generously extended their young architects program to Istanbul, as well as to other cities. So slowly, now we have the support of Columbia University to do Studio-X. So let's say the city is slowly gearing up to also being able to host a discussion on a design level.
Okay, well, let me ask a negative question. So those are all the great things that the city can do. What are the limits? What are the things that you could not do in Istanbul? What are the things that people would laugh at if you proposed?
I think laugh at is difficult, but what you cannot do is, there's a lot to learn in the construction sector for detailing, and, there is, in some ways, I mean, the life of an architect is still not so easy when it comes to building, so obviously there's that world, a refinement, it takes a lot, I think, to get that level of construction refinement in the industry, and it's not easy. You have to fight for that, and in some ways, I think it's still very difficult to get a good critical conversation. This is actually quite impossible. This, it's always very fun, and we were talking about it with Gregors yesterday. That when we come to New York, the ease at which the conversations happen on anything is a very something that we're always jealous of. I think that the fact that an idea can be discussed at length from different point of views, and it's almost a joy to discuss. This is not so easy in Turkey. It's a joy to talk, but to do a kind of very objective conversation about an issue like that's. So in all that, we're very excited about the Studio-X project because that's both of those things, both the quality of design and execution, like seen in hopefully with the Taylor Creed project or similar projects, and also the potential discussions we can have are just kind of very exciting for us.
Well, I mean, to touch upon the first point, the kind of the difficulty in the construction sector and actually implementing things, it does strike me that, I don't know if all or much of your materials research and the kind of research that you do in that way happens in Western Europe or in Northern Europe rather than in Istanbul. Yes. So there is still really a sense of like kind of you're manufacturing those seats for the open library in Denmark or Belgium and then bringing them to Istanbul rather than being able to use the kind of industrial production capacity within Istanbul at the same time that you have other industries kind of actually engaging in Turkey in precisely those kinds of activities.
I mean, in theory, Turkey should be the ideal place to do research and development on materials and kind of processes and whatnot, but the reality of it is not that yet. Maybe it will be, but so so that's definitely an area that the government also should, I guess they will, or maybe they are, and we don't really see it because we are sort of at the end of the food chain in terms of industry, but
we heard earlier today, basically Turkey operates as the industry for Europe, right? I mean, most of all the heavy industry have moved to Turkey, and Europe is not really producing much anymore, but Turkey is really the supplier to Europe.
But at the same time, it actually, for itself, and within Turkey, you're having difficulties building the things that you want in the way that you want them built. So there's a kind of contradiction.
Yes, there's a bit of contradiction, but that's maybe also natural, and it's probably a part of the game that once you start producing, you also have to start developing the know-how around the production. So, I mean, for example, the Vakko project that was discussed 2 days ago on Monday, showed the potential of the industry that you can actually produce a very high-end, kind of a highly specialized glass facade system locally, and you can only do that because the local producers are quite small and flexible in their production lines. But that, you don't see 20 Vakko buildings, you see one. You wish you could see 20 Vakko buildings.
Well, there might be something also, there's obviously something to be said for bringing within any given context external influences to the idea of, the fact that you are actually coming from having worked in different contexts and bringing those to Istanbul and what that does for the local discourse.
Sure.
So, why don't we open it up to, there must be questions, I'm sure, to this presentation.
As I understand it, that Istanbul has a severe shortage of open space parks. And is there some reason that they seem to have this shortage as compared to Central Park or whatever here? I mean, it's almost like an overthought or oversight not to have open space even at the local area with basketball courts and such.
It has a little bit to do with how the urbanization processes happened in the 70s, 80s. It was mostly kind of informal housing. The city grew a lot from 1950s onwards, where a lot of internal migration to the city from the rural areas took place. So it was 1 million and it became 15 million within sort of 2 decades. And then the infrastructure of the city wasn't enough, so people built their own houses. When they built their own houses, they built one stories, and it was 2-story, 1-story areas, and it had gardens and whatnot, because people were actually building to live in them. But then it all became a sort of small business when, during the legalization of these slum areas, the government granted them 4 stories for their plots. So with this legalization, it came also additional building rights, so then it became sort of small plots that were small houses became apartment buildings, and kind of that brought the density. So these areas kind of have evolved without much planning, and what was very nice and human scale or whatever had rural qualities as gecekondu areas, when they became post gecekondu areas, became very dense and not sufficient in terms of green space. But then again, I think the green space is a strange subject in Istanbul, because the urban environment is actually really the streets. The streets are very actively used, and they are right now they're not. We don't really need to have parks everywhere. We just need to have good working streets where the cars and the pedestrian traffic can be accommodated. And for us, because like for example now the municipalities have a rule where they take building islands and they give much less footprint per island. So that means you end up with towers with green space around them, yes, but then you don't have streets anymore. So you lose the tissue of the city that is binding itself together. So, we are always kind of skeptical also, or kind of critical of the issue of, okay, we want more green space, but at the expense of what? If that comes at the expense of streets, we are losing we're not winning.
Thanks. I'm curious, this question, we'll touch on this, but I'm curious about the research that you're doing and the sort of the work that you do, and also the conditions that are very particular to Istanbul, sort of in light of the Studio-X connection and the emergence of that. How do you sort of see that feeding back into this broader discourse that we're getting into about cities, and sort of, do you see like your research, your work having applications to a sort of more general way of talking and looking at cities, and sort of also the particularities of Istanbul being able to feed back into sort of what we get out of it?
I think we will kind of figure that out more in the course of the next 3-4 whatever years as the Studio-X network. I mean, I think that's what's brilliant about the Studio-X network, is they're very both local and at the same time connected, so you can really figure out what is really local and what is really kind of global. But we don't really have the answers for that yet. But it's an interesting thing for us, I think, for everyone who is interested in cities to think about. I mean, we're young, and at the same time, as a practice, we don't have all the tools, so we are trying to kind of figure out what we can figure out. And I'm sure as the investigations have broader teams and bigger teams and more access to information, then it will get more precise. Right now it's also kind of not super precise. So we're looking forward to asking that question altogether.
Question over there.
So I have a question about the live nature of some of the data that you mentioned. This is something you mentioned at the very beginning, talking about the Minibüs maps, how the moment you make the map, it's obsolete. So I was wondering if you ever considered sort of making a live map, one that somehow sort of updates the data, either by having some kind of like pavilions or the data feeding into the system, and then the users can also give feedback on like their demands, and the drivers can put in their information, so it becomes a digital database of updating data. Then it doesn't only become a research, but it becomes a tool that can improve the traffic system somehow.
Yeah, the answer is very short, yes. We're working on it right now.
Oh.
So hopefully it will be accessible within a half a year time or something. But of course, we are not app developers, but
we are maybe slowly realizing that maybe we should be. So that's also a part of it. I mean, we are investing in our office our time to look into new media technologies and what can be done as tools for the city and for the urban environment. But
yeah, I mean, obviously with the Dolmuş and Minibüs system, there is enormous challenges in terms of getting the information, but there is of course also
tracking devices.
Huh?
Have you tracking devices? Is that an option?
Yeah, but I mean, how do you?
I mean, it can be done. It's really like with all of those projects, you really need to set your mind on which one you want to do, and then really invest a couple of years of your energy to pull them, to make them reality. So we are interested. We're toying with a bunch of ideas like that, but which one we will really tackle, I don't really know, because there's a lot also you can do with the mappings and with routes and with even tourist guides, you know, or it's very specific routes you can plan, or very specific tours you could curate. You know, there's so much one can do, but depends on what sort of resources will be available. But it's in our interest. Thank you.
I mean, for us, it's also usually more fun to do the things that hasn't been done before, right? So, yes, we did the minibus map because no one else had done it. Of course, to now really do a real functioning working map is much more effort than just to do, let's say, a fixed printed map. Maybe it's, as I was saying, much more interesting and prudent to invest time in something other that hasn't done before. So that was a question up there.
I was interested in the idea of being a Turkish living in Istanbul, and how, in the context of a globalizing Istanbul today, which is becoming more and more connected to maybe other global centers in the world, as opposed to other parts of Turkey. And so, from what I know, I think being Turkish and living in Istanbul is becoming more and more different from being Turkish and living in another part of the country. And how do you think that will play out in the years to come, and in terms of identity and what it means to be Turkish and living in a globalized city? And how do you think Studio-X sort of fits into that dynamic?
In some ways, maybe Istanbul is a relatively resilient city. In some ways, yes, we are. It depends who you ask. Like sometimes we talk about the city as changing very fast, but at the same time, when you look at it in comparison with other cities, maybe it's actually not changing so fast. So maybe yes, it is being gentrified. Yes, it's being very globalized, but at the same time, maybe it is actually. Maybe that's only our perception, because that's the part of the city that we see, and there's maybe a large part of the city that we don't see, we don't talk about, that is still Istanbul in what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You know, I think that's really kind of ties back to the issue of what is local, what is global, and needs to be looked at. I don't see it as a very obvious thing that Istanbul is becoming detached from the rest of the country. I mean, because it still has a lot of people who identify themselves with their hometowns. You know, that's the migration culture. It's still there. I mean, you sometimes, it's not as much as 10 years ago, where every taxi driver would ask you where you're from, but you still get that question, where you're expected to belong somewhere else and not to Istanbul, where, you know, your hometown is still what you identify yourself with. So I don't see it as maybe dramatic as you suggest in some ways.
Could you speak to what you see as the architecture community's role in influencing what you described as the future of democracy in light of the Gezi Park protests? I know it's a large question.
No, I think it was a series of coincidences over the summer, and I think architects had a part in it, but there were other things that actually made it become much bigger than, you know, it could have finished. All the protests in the summer could have finished on the first day. It could have finished on the first weekend. It could have finished almost 2 weeks afterwards, but it didn't, because it was a strange kind of series of things that happened. You know, the police attacks, the media silenced media, then some of the speeches made by different government officials and so forth. So yes, it was a very architectural problem, and then it became a very social problem. So I don't know how much credit to take as architects. You know, we were very happy in some ways that some of the issues that we were trying to talk about for a couple of years, or for some of the people involved for maybe decades, were being openly discussed finally. But you know, I think it wasn't probably our making at all.
I guess my question is kind of going forward. Do you think the architectural community will perhaps continue with whatever has the conversation that has opened?
There's a lot of excitement for sure, and there is a lot of questions. Okay, what happens next? How do we turn this kind of new awareness into something productive and useful? But you know, there's a lot of processes to invent. I mean, when we were talking to the government officials, also they kept saying, you know, we don't know what to do, because we've never had a direct request as such come to us. So we don't have the processes to make it work. So it's a task for all sides of the problem to keep thinking of, okay, what is a participatory process? How do you actually generate discussion around the development project? How do you, I mean, there's models, of course, elsewhere. I mean, there's a lot of successful models in Europe and whatnot, but what is the Turkish model for that? It's a question to figure out.
So maybe it's the last question. No, I just wanted to say, make a comment, which another thing that happened in Turkey. I mean, this great excitement, I'm really grateful for, but the government always starts to do their subjects, so the AIA equivalent of Turkey actually managed to have some rights after this process of, yes, there's some excitement, but at the same time there's some step back, right? Yeah. In Turkey, so also a part of this complex issue that I guess we all don't know what we're going to happen.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a much deeper conversation. We can have it also tomorrow we will have a special event tomorrow at Studio-X New York about the protest and public space. So we can carry on that conversation, I think, there, because it's a very long conversation, and I also look forward to doing that with you, Koray, tomorrow. Or
well, one thing I think we'll thank you everyone for the great questions. Thank you to Superpool. I want to just make one last quick comment, which relates to something you said about this kind of app, or the idea of developing something that could take on this Dolmuş map and make it something real. Something kind of live. And I mean, of course, there are these kind of different ways to approach that. You could say, okay, we're going to find investors and we're going to make this kind of app and we're going to develop it as a company and we're going to set up a business plan. Or, on the other hand, what I think is very interesting about your practice is that I take that first Dolmuş map as a provocation, as something that actually, rather than, in a way, in the most kind of freeing sense of the word, in the sense that it can actually throw something out into a public space, it can ask certain questions, it can do so in a way that gets people thinking and maybe leads to other results, but it doesn't necessarily have to start from a premise of being a kind of practical solution or a thing that has an answer. And to me, that's the kind of interesting question, is how can you actually open up this space without having an end goal in sight? So hopefully that will also tie into your discussion of Gezi and everything that's happening in Turkey. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Superpool.
That's awesome.